The first time they noticed the shadow in the hallway was a week after they moved into the old Victorian house. They'd been unpacking boxers in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The only sounds there, hushed voices and the creak of floorboards under their feet. Ten suddenly. What was that? Lily had stopped dead in her tracks, staring down the long, narrow hallway towards the front door. Mark and Ethan had followed her gaze to see a dark, distinct shape standing in the middle of the hallway. It looked like one of those shadow puppets they used to make when they were kids, only this was 3 times larger than either Mark or Ethan, and it didn't move. They stared at each other for a moment, then at the shadow, trying to decide if they should call out or try to get closer. But before any of them could move, the shadow shifted slightly, just enough to show that it was breathing. Then it was still again. "Watch in, team. Maybe it's just a trick of the light," Mark had suggested, though his voice sounded shaky even to his own ears. He tried to keep his tone light, but fear had iced his blood. As they watched, the shadow seemed to grow longer and darker, taking on a life of its own. Then it began to move, gliding down the hall towards them, growing longer with every step. "Run!" Lily screamed. And all 3 of them did. They ran until they were out of breath, until they couldn't hear the scrape of the shadow's footsteps behind them. Only when they were safe in their bedroom, locked the door and drawn the curtains, did they dare to speak. "What was that thing?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. No one had an answer. Not then, and not for many weeks afterwards. But what they did know was that they weren't alone in the house. Whatever or whoever had been stalking them in the shadows. That night, they slept fitfully, each jump at the sound of a floorboard creaking or a window pane rattling in its frame. But sleep or no sleep, they knew they had to get up and face whatever was haunting them. The strange thing was, they weren't scared of whatever it was. Not really. They were more confused, more curious than anything, and once they'd made that decision, they felt stronger, braver, ready to take on the darkness. At first, it was hard to tell if it was still there. The house was huge, filled with dark corners and dusty nooks, and the sunlight slanted through the grimy windows and odd shafts. But as the days passed, they began to notice things. Little things that happened when they weren't looking. Sounds that seemed to come from nowhere, and always that feeling of being watched. Then one day they found the drawing. It was in the attic, in a box filled with old toys and trinkets. A simple sketch of the house done in charcoal on aged paper. But it wasn't the house that made them stop in surprise. It was the words written in elegant looping script in the corner of the page. "My home is filled with shadows, and the shadows have learned my name." It took them a moment to realize that the drawing wasn't just of the house, it was of their house. The house they'd moved into just weeks before, and the shadows in the drawing matched the ones that had greeted them in the hallway, the ones that had stalked them, the ones that still moved in the periphery of their vision. The question was, why? Why had the shadows come to live in their house? What did they want? They never did find the answer to those questions. But what they learned next was much worse. After the initial shock of discovering the drawing, they began to watch the shadows more closely, not because they were afraid, but because they were fascinated. It was like watching a shy animal, skittish and quick, always darting away before it could be caught. And then they learned something else. The shadows weren't just in the hallway. They were everywhere, always mimicking their movements, always just out of sight. But there was something else, something sinister lurking beneath the surface. The shadows were learning their routines. First, it had been the hallway, then the kitchen, then the living room. Each time they turned to face the darkness, they saw the outline of the shadow retreating around the corner. But each time they turned back, it was still there, watching Tim. One evening, while they were eating dinner in silence, the power went out and the house was plunged into darkness. When Mark went to the window to check on the storm, Lily felt a cold draft and heard a creak behind her. She turned slowly and saw the shadow of a man standing in the doorway. It was tall and thin, almost skeletal, and it seemed to pulse in the gloom. "Ethan?" she said, her voice shaking. Her husband didn't respond. He was staring at the table as if mesmerized, his eyes wide and unseeing. "Ethan, look," she whispered, reaching out to touch him. But he flinched away from her touch, and she drew back her hand. When the lights came back on, Lily turned to find Ethan sitting calmly at the table, his face pale and his eyes blank. "What did you just say?" he asked. "Nothing," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. She didn't want to admit how frightened she was. Not in front of him, not in front of anyone. So she forced herself to smile and change the subject. But the shadows continued to follow them, growing bolder with every passing day. Then one morning, Lily woke to find a drawing on her pillow, a perfect likeness of her done in charcoal. Beside it was a single word, watching. She woke Ethan immediately, and together they confronted the darkness in their closet. It was empty, as it had been every time they dared to look inside. But that same day, Ethan came home to find both Lily and Mark gone, and a note left in their place. It simply said, "I'm sorry," and was signed with a name that wasn't theirs. Panic constricted his throat. Had they left him? Where had they gone? Had they called for help? As the sun set, casting long shadows across the floor, he realized they hadn't. They were trapped in their own personal hell, stalked by a creature they couldn't see, spoken to only in whispers and darkness. And then he saw it, the shadow of a man standing in the doorway, and he knew he wasn't alone. With a scream, he fled to the attic, slamming the door behind him and locking it. There in the dusty gloom, surrounded by forgotten toys and trinkets, he found the box with the drawing, and as he pulled it out, the shadow of a woman formed behind him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she whispered, and Ethan felt a cold dread grip his heart. He recognized the drawing now. The house, the shadows, the words. It was a warning, a message from beyond the grave. Then he heard a scratching at the door, a slow, deliberate scratching that sent shivers down his spine. Whatever was out there wanted in. With a surge of adrenaline, he pushed the box away and raced to hide in the far corner of the attic, pressing himself against the dusty rafters. The door began to creak open, and he squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the darkness to envelop him, waiting for the scratching to stop. But it kept going, louder now, more frantic, and then he heard a voice, a dry, raspy voice, like the rustle of dead leaves. "Let me in," it rasped, and Ethan felt a cold, clammy hand close over his mouth. He screamed, but the sound died in his throat, as the shadows enveloped him, pulling him into the darkness. The house was silent once more, the only sound the wind whistling through the broken window panes. In the attic, the box lay open, the drawing gone, and in its place, a single black feather. On the floor below, the shadow stretched and yawned, its form solidifying into that of a man. He smiled, revealing teeth that were too long and too sharp, and vanished into the gloom. The next morning, the police found the house empty, the front door hanging off its hinges. All that remained of the family was a pile of ashes in the fireplace and a single black feather on the hearth rug. To this day, no one knows what happened to them, but some say their souls are trapped in the house, doomed to wander its halls forever. Others say the shadows claimed them as their own, and now they walk the earth as shadows, forever hunted by the darkness.